In this video, I'm going to be doing a tour of my Inktober 2017 sketchbook, and I'll be talking about what went wrong with it. This sketchbook has lots of issues in terms of it being very inconsistent with the overall quality, style, use of materials, and general drawing skills. It's not a video made for me to essentially point and laugh at my own artwork. I've made it so I can reflect on it and aim to do better this coming Inktober based on what I've learned from doing this. I wrote the prompts each day in the front so I could have a little reminder, and the first prompt was swift. I drew a little illustration of a swift bird and it's got a flock of birds flying out of its mouth. Not entirely sure why I made that decision, but I guess it makes more of an interesting composition. You might also be able to see that Tipp-Ex has been used around the page. This is because on the other side, which I'll turn to now, I made the mistake of using a Sharpie marker to do an outline around the heads, and that went straight through to the other side, which I hadn't anticipated when I probably should have done. So I ended up making a paler wash of black ink for the background to try to avoid that bleeding through too. Small amounts of it did, but it wasn't as noticeable as the marker. The prompt for this drawing was divide. I went with the idea of trying to illustrate a divided mind or a split mind, or the idea of people having layers behind each other. Each face has a slightly different expression, but the changes are pretty subtle from one to another. The first has more of a neutral look, the second looks a bit more sad, and the third was supposed to look scared, but most of it's covered by the heads in front of it, so it's quite hard to tell. This drawing here is based on poison. It's quite grotesque compared to the rest of the sketchbook, and if you look carefully you can see that the liquid that's been injected contains the word hate that's written over and over. The letters are pretty pale here, so I don't know, maybe I didn't want it to be too obvious. I also went with a crosshatch background instead of an ink wash to avoid the bleeding, and I tried experimenting with using lots of tiny dots to shade with. You might notice that especially early on in this sketchbook it's a lot more heavy on the concept, but it varies from prompt to prompt. This one here is underwater. I quite like the way that this one turned out actually. This was one where I tried using a tonal ink wash. I knew the background from the page behind was crosshatched, so I wasn't too worried about the prospect of it bleeding through to the other side. What I didn't anticipate was the paper just not being able to hold water well at all. In places you can see it actually started to tear where my brush was painting. So some of the things that look like highlights in the water weren't actually supposed to be there. This was just where the page ended up getting roughed up. I was quite fortunate that this only happened at the water because it actually ended up working quite well in my favour. And it was in this drawing I realised I couldn't get that much of a tonal range in this sketchbook because it really doesn't hold dark values well, and the values tended to bleed into each other quite a lot. This one is based on the prompt long. I still kind of like the concept of it, but I think it would have been much better if I took it further and had the entire body wrapped up in this tangle of tape, kind of like mummified. This is a double page spread based on sword. There's one in the middle. I remember modelling the composition from, that really stereotypical evolutionary drawing where you get like a creature turning into a monkey, then a caveman, then it turns into a man, and there's loads of parody copies of it, like when you end up with a guy sitting at a computer after all that evolution. But I did a similar thing with weapons, and there's an empty gap left here on purpose. Again, this is very heavy on the concept, and I think this one kind of speaks for itself without me having to explain it. This is based on shy and the feeling of wanting to be invisible when you feel like other people are watching you. There's a little conveniently labelled invisibility button, and the figure has presumably pressed it because there's an empty figure by it. And this one was based on the prompt crooked, and I guess I started to be more playful and stepping away from heavier subject matter like the previous ones. It's someone measuring a set of teeth and not looking too happy with their job. The style's a lot more cartoony for this one as well, and I hadn't realised at the time how much I was varying the style from page to page. Oh dear. This one was based on Screech. It's a tad on the melodramatic side maybe. Definitely one of the drawings I'm not happy with how it turned out. Might have been better if the figure was really detailed and realistic to contrast it with the scribbles and text, but moving on. This one was gigantic. I guess I didn't just want to draw a mountain, so I ended up making this sort of floating, rocky fantasy looking planet. It's one of those things where I know what it's supposed to be, but it probably looks pretty ambiguous to anyone else. The prompt here was run. I have mixed feelings about this one. I like the concept. It's pretty subtle this time. There are all these clocks and then the shadows of two figures running at the bottom. So there's all these interpretations about running from time or running out of time. I'm really tempted to redraw this at some point, but with more elaborate clocks. This one was shattered. You can see she's reading a letter or note, and you can see all these lines and breaks that originate from where she's holding it. I think it definitely looked a lot better in my head than how it turned out, but I'm trying not to focus too much on the negatives here. I could have really done with using a proper reference here, because some bits of it, like especially the hands and how she's holding the piece of paper, just look off. This was teeming. I think my first idea was going to be doing like a coral reef or something, so it'd be teeming with life, but it went in a different direction with making it a bunch of cells. I think it's antibodies and blood cells, but don't quote me on that. The prompt here was fierce. I think I was going with the idea of fiercely guarded. I still like the concept here, but there's a recurring thing in my sketchbook of how the drawing turned out not matching the quality I wanted it to be. Part of it's that I've developed my technique since then. Another is laziness, with sometimes just not finding proper references or not making the effort to put them together better. And part of that probably had something to do with drawing every single day, which I was not used to at this point at all. And I think instead of having a semi-realistic heart in the middle of all these spikes, it might have been better to have the whole thing drawn in the same style. It's a bit of a strange mix of realistic and then cartoony. This one's based on mysterious. There are some prints drawn on the floor. Might not be illustrated that clearly that they're supposed to be footprints. I think I was going for a Bigfoot in the forest type thing. And this one was based on fat. So I drew an elephant seal feeding itself with its little trunk / nozzle thing. This was based on Graceful. It was supposed to be like a butterfly versus a moth type of thing, and looking at how differently we treat them, I don't think it's easy to tell that the bottom one is a moth because the whole drawing's in black and white. It's kind of funny how my illustration kind of ended up illustrating my own point in that there's not that much difference between them. The prompt here was filthy. This was another I'm really not keen on. I think I ended up going with the idea of filthy rich, and there's some spray paint on the wall behind the guy that I think says more, so I guess Reed might have supposed to come into this as well. Honestly, I'm really not sure what's going on in this one. This was based on Cloud. She's got this swarm of bees or flies around her head, and the camera probably hasn't picked it up because the lettering is so tiny, but some of the bees have writing on them instead of stripes. Like one says dull, another says a liar. This is another that really would have benefited from using a proper reference, especially for their face and body. I'm not sure what the reason was why I didn't. This one's based on Deep. It's pretty self-explanatory. I quite like the horror look that this one's going on. It's a really textured image as well. It's definitely one of the most atmospheric drawings I've got in this sketchbook. This one's furious. I mean, yeah, she looks pretty angry. The prompt here was trail, so I went with the idea of a dress trail. I really like up until around this point, because after that her posture looks kind of strange and the proportions and the shape of her head isn't right, and maybe I'm being a bit too much of a perfectionist, but that irritates me. This one's based on Juicy. This was a more fun one. It's a blender with a lot of berries whizzing around inside it. Some of them have tiny screaming faces. This one's based on Blind, yet another one where I like the concept. The idea was being blind when we look at ourselves, but it could have been so much better with the composition and how it turned out. So maybe one day I'll redo this idea. This was Shep, again, self-explanatory. The only thing worth mentioning is that it's kind of unclear whether the ship's on the sea or floating through clouds. This was based on Squeak. One of the first things to come to mind was guinea pigs getting excited to be fed. I quite like this one, even though it's pretty different to the rest of the drawings because it looks like something that could be on a card or something. This was Climb. We've got a mountain goat and then someone else trying to climb up the rock next to it. I like to think the mountain goat's giving that guy a very strange look. This was Fall. Got an astronaut falling through space. I think it might have been nice to do a similar thing to the one I did with Deep and have a really textured background. This was United. And it's a really good example of what can happen when you don't use the right paper for what media you're using. There's all these dots and splodges that aren't supposed to be here. I think they came from the black background of the other side because I used marker for that, and this page was fine until I added the ink wash for the sky, and that's what caused it to bleed through. There's also this white outline that I think ended up coming through in time because I ended up mixing a bit of gel with ink. It's definitely one I'd like to redraw sometime. There are quite a lot in this sketchbook, so it's more of an ideas sketchbook rather than a refined sketchbook, and I think the composition's really nice, and the two figures just sat listening to music is kind of sweet. They just need cleaning up. I think it'd be an image that'd be really nice with bright, bold block colours as well. This was based on Found, so we've got a Lost Island thing going on, and someone being rescued by a helicopter. And the last one was Mask. I think the idea is pretty clear in this one. We've got an upset looking girl staring into the mask of a happy face. Again, this is just one where the anatomy was off. I mean, look at those arms, they're so thin. And it probably would have been better if there was a background and just more detail with the pen. I think my main issues outside of my technical drawing skills can be summed up with just a few points. The first is that I need a higher quality sketchbook if I'm going to be using washes of ink. The one that I used here was only 150 GSM, which isn't suitable for ink. Another is not to be afraid to rely on references. And another main point for me is that since the main challenge of Inktober is drawing every single day, I'm not going to make it extra hard for myself by trying to illustrate all these elaborate concepts again. I think it'd be better for someone like me if I didn't rush them and gave them each the time they deserve. And if I want a more cohesive and together looking project, it might be better to choose my own theme and do 31 drawings related to that instead of following the official prompt list. I'll be uploading daily videos to my channel for this coming October 2018, so feel free to check it out if you're interested in seeing how it goes, and I hope you enjoyed watching this. Bye!